This podcast is a production of the Cable Podcast Network.
In the pines, where the sun never shines, you'll shiver when the cold wind blows. There's a grave in the pines where the sun never shines. There's a grave that's shaded with the pines.
Welcome back to The Land Between the Meadows, a history of Kentucky. We first want to take a moment to apologize for our short hiatus where we've had to make a little extra money. Mr. Pope has been working at Keeneland.
Print some extra money. We got the presses running. $100 bills.
Well, Mr. Pope, he's enjoyed a great month of working at Keeneland, another great staple of Kentucky and horse racing.
Playing the horses.
Yeah, trying to get rich quick. Don't know if that worked out for him, but
not so well.
But anyway, we apologize again for our long void of episodes, and now we're ready to get back at it and explore more into Kentucky and the great history that we have. We're going to continue also on Simon Kenton, because we got about halfway through his life, his meetings with Daniel Boone, running through the woods naked and those situations he got himself into. But now we're going to look into his later life.
The Frontiersman by Alan W. Eckert, September 17, 1778, Thursday. When he finished, they untied his ankles, and Bona led him toward the town. At the foot of the hill, southeast of the village, a double line of men and women, from ancient ages all the way down to the smallest children who could wield a stick, stretched a full quarter of a mile to end at the massive council house. There were easily 400 people in the line, each with a stick, switch, or club, 4 to 6 feet in height. They stripped his clothes from him again, and Bona pointed at the council house with his hickory stick. "You run to the Miskamiqua. If you stop or fall, you start over." He stepped behind the frontiersman, and at the beat of the starting drum from the council house, laid his stick across Simon's back with such force that the frontiersman thought his shoulder blades were broken. Simon ran, ignoring the pain in his body from the previous injuries, taking great bounding strides that often got him past the waiting Indians before they could react enough to land their blows. Even then he was hit often, though seldom with very great force because of his forward speed. Near the end of the line, and with safety close, he was suddenly confronted by a warrior who stepped into his path, his club at ready. Simon increased rather than slackened his speed, and with his clenched fist punched the man between the eyes with such a tremendous blow that he broke his nose and sent him sprawling senseless into his companions in the line. But the pause this occasioned was disastrous. A heavy stick thudded against his temple, and he was grasped his head in pain. More blows rained down upon him until he fell, dazed. Dimly he was aware of other blows falling on him, but then they stopped, and he felt himself lifted and half propelled, half dragged back to the starting point, amidst the howls of delight from the Indians in the line. They let him rest for perhaps 10 minutes, when once more they reached the head of the line. When the drum sounded again, Bona struck him with the stick while he was set on the ground, and then struck him again as he scrambled to his feet. Once more he was on his way, but the blows had told to him, and his speed had diminished. More and more frequently he was being struck. Abruptly he turned and leaped high, his feet catching a squaw full in the stomach and bowling her over, and then outside the lines he raced for the council house. From the line ahead of him a squaw rushed toward him, and as she raised a hefty club over her head, he knew he should dodge around her, but somehow his body wouldn't answer quickly enough, and the club hit his neck and knocked him sprawling. Instantly he became the center of a growing circle of people, striking him with clubs and switches, fists and feet. Even after he was unconscious, they beat him for a long time. This describes the gauntlet, which Simon Kenton, in all of his explorations after being captured, ran 9 different times, 9 different gauntlets. He was a true treasure of a captive to the Shawnee Indians in Ohio. And he was paraded from village to village and ran gauntlets. And this is just one, occasion where Simon Kenton did this. At one point, his head's bashed in with a war club. Imagine it was a stone club. And he, of course, was knocked unconscious for days. He had a hole in his head for the rest of his life because of that occasion.
So when you talk about a gauntlet, what exactly do we mean a gauntlet?
Well, as this was prepared, there are two lines of Indians, like they said and described, a quarter of a mile long, if you can imagine, a quarter of a mile, standing shoulder to shoulder, two lanes, and you run down this lane, and everyone gets to take a look at you. They hit you with, they have switches, they have briars, they have clubs, and they just beat the holy heck out of you as you run, knocking you to the ground. I'm not sure, but I've read somewhere that Simon Kenton was the only human being to ever escape a gauntlet alive.
Yeah.
And he did it 9 times.
Wow.
And you can see from this one thing, they bashed his brains in and knocked him practically unconscious and made him do it again and again until he could get to the end of the line. If you didn't make it to the end of the line, they usually beat you until they killed you.
Yeah. Why were they making him do the gauntlet so much? Or why was he in there?
In the first place, he was captured. And Simon Kenton, I mean, that's a great answer. Why, he certainly wasn't friends with the Shawnee. They feared him. I mean, he was like, kind of like a god. We told how his gun is never empty. He had a name for that because he could run and shoot his flintlock rifle. He was condemned to death at one point, and that kind of takes me into this because Simon Kenton was a frontier fighter. I mean, we've talked a little bit about how he came to be. Kenton, we talked about how he was just a legendary frontiersman, and he was a soldier in Kentucky and West Virginia and Ohio. He was born in Fauquier County, Virginia. He was of Scotch Welsh and even Irish origin. The thing about Kenton was he was illiterate, just like Boone. He never learned to read or write a lick. And when he was 16 years old, we talked about how he became, involved with a young woman, and she chose another man, and he was jealous and beat the man half to death. And so he changed his name from Simon Kenton to Simon Butler, and he wandered the wilderness of Kentucky. That was in our first episode. We talked about that a little bit. Then he finally found out that the man that he beat didn't die, and so he changed his name back to Butler. But the Indians called him Baldair because they couldn't pronounce Butler. He moved to Boonesboro. We talked about how he saved Daniel Boone. He was just truly an American hero, from the very beginning. He was really something, and he was very wise in the wilderness, and he helped a lot of people come into Kentucky, as a guide, just like Boone did. He was a big man in stature. He was very strong. His stamina was often tested and endured, the worst tests possible on the frontier. But he was very brilliant in the way that he could survive in the wilderness. Obviously, you mentioned at the beginning how, he and some of his trapping partners were surprised by Shawnee, and one of them was killed, and they were drying their clothes on a stick, and they ran through the woods naked and escaped in late winter, learned to live and survive, So he could do about anything. But he was captured. They blackened his face because that was a sign of death. They were going to burn him at the stake. Yeah. And that wasn't pleasant. And I knew you said that you had somebody who had contacted you, wanted to know about Simon Girty, and how Simon Girty. And I said, well, Simon Girty plays right into the Simon Kenton legacy. Simon Girty really gives us a whole different approach to history, trying to understand him. Yes. He's known as a renegade. He was born in Pennsylvania. His family was attacked by Indians and killed. He lived during the American Revolution. He went and was adopted by the Seneca Indians, which is part of the Iroquois League. By the time Girty was 14, his family had moved to this Sherman's Creek, and this was during the French and Indian War, where the Indians attacked and killed his father, and he was taken captive. As the British colonists moved into the area, they needed Girty's help because he learned 7 different languages, Native American languages, in addition to French and English. So he fought in the French and Indian War, he fought in Lord Dunmore's War, and he traded back and forth. He met Simon Kenton at Fort Pitt, and they were scouts for Lord Dunmore's War, and they became really good friends. Long story short, Girty got put off by the Americans because of the way they treated the Indians. He was part of a thing that went to a village where there were squaws and children, and the colonists killed them.
Yeah.
And it really turned him off. And so he switched to the Indian side. And then he switched to fighting with the British against the colonists in the American Revolution. And one thing that's really important to kind of get a grip on here in Kentucky when we look at Kentucky history is that during the American Revolution, the frontiersmen, the colonists, fought the Indians and the British.
Yeah.
You know, and this is true like the Battle of Blue Licks, you know, and all these the Battle of Siege of Boonesboro that we talked about. You know, those are British officers.
Yes.
Same way with Harrodsburg. There were British officers mixed in with the Indians. And they gave the Indians guns and encouraged them, you know, to fight. So Girty, you know, he'd get tired of the British, would go to the French, or he'd fight the Indians. He was an interpreter at treaties, and he became a friend of Simon Kenton. I want to read you an excerpt from the Frontiersmen when, in their young age, when Simon Kenton and Simon Girty are working together as scouts, and they become blood brothers. This takes place in October the 5th, 1774. It said, one night as Kenton and Girty were resting in a small cave along the Muskingum, Girty suggested that the two of them bond themselves together in brotherhood in a sacred rite he had learned from the Senecas. What it meant, he explained, was that their blood became one and they were brothers and would vow to forever help and protect one another at all times. Regardless of risk, there weren't many people a man could depend on in this country, he added, and it would be good to know there was at least one. Simon agreed readily, and Girty, with a shallow flick of his knife, laid open his own and Simon's right wrists. Then they gripped each other's forearms so that the incisions met and pressed tightly together and the blood mingled. The grip was held for several minutes, during which first Girty and then Kenton swore eternal friendship, brotherhood, devotion, and protection, one for the other, as long as they both should live. It was a solemn and impressive ritual, and the youth felt a great warmth for his companion. He hoped one day to be able to prove the strength of the bond. Yet, even though he trusted Girty implicitly and felt great friendship for him, he could not bring himself to reveal that his name was Kenton, not Butler. The threat of the noose was still too distinct a reality for carelessness. Now, if we kind of fast forward ahead, and we've been talking about these gauntlets, we talked about Simon Kenton blackened his face, which is a sign of death. The Shawnees did. They got tired of fooling with him.
Yeah.
They're going to burn him at the stake.
Yeah.
Here comes Girty. And, you know, this is years later after this. Now, Girty has a reputation of being basically just a ruthless killer.
Yeah.
I mean, he's full of hate.
Yeah.
And he just kills the heck out of everybody, you know. And white men and the Shawnee were torturing Colonel Crawford, and you know, he's tied to a stake and burning. And he's begging Gurney to shoot him to put him out of his misery, and Girty just walks away from him and laughs. Yeah, you know, while they cut his guts out, and you know, just horrible. Yeah, and this reputation gets told all around that Girty has no feeling. He's ruthless. Yeah. He's ruthless, and you don't want to be on his side. So. Even though Girty's got a certain status among the Shawnee, here's his friend, his blood brother. And so what he does is he goes to the council meeting, and right before they're getting ready to kill Simon Kenton, and he says, you know, this is such a brave warrior and everything. We need him on our side. Let's see if we can adopt him. Yeah. So by the skin of his teeth, he gets them to agree to adopt Simon Kenton. Shortly after that, he convinces the British that this would be a great prisoner of war to have in Detroit. Yeah. And so they trade him in Detroit for money and guns and whiskey and whatever they wanted. So Simon goes to Detroit and eventually escapes from Detroit and comes back to Mason County, to Maysville, to Limestone, Kentucky. And continues his life. Wow,
that is that's quite amazing, and I find it interesting. The blood brother pact. It's a Native American thing. I never put it together that was something that came from Native Americans. And two, though, you talked about Girty's ruthlessness, but unique because you were saying that when he was young, his family was killed. Right. So that would be obviously a bring up some hate and some problems. But then he was with the Americans, correct? And
he was adopted by the Senecas at 14 years old and lived with them. And then he became an interpreter.
There you go.
In the Revolution, the Senecas and the colonists became allies.
Yeah.
Against the French.
And then you said, though, that the colonists, killed a bunch of women and children, Native Americans. That turned them against them. But yet then he turns into this wild, ruthless killer.
Exactly.
It's a little bit of hypocrisy, I guess, there. But
it really is.
But yeah, it's a unique little.
Historians look at that, and they don't really call it a hypocrisy. It changes them how we look at history.
Yeah.
They call, some historians, modern historians particularly, call Boone and Kenton a myth.
Yeah.
Because it's all based on the European concept of history. It's not taken from a Native American. I mean, here you've got these people, these savages, they call them, who are coming down in Kentucky, places like Fort Logan, Boonesboro, attacking, killing innocent, stranded people out in cabins, their family, the women, the children, everything else. But they're encroaching on their hunting land. They need this food to survive.
Yeah.
So, who's bad here?
Yeah.
But our history is written that Boone's a hero, Kenton's a hero because they kill all these Indians. And it's not right. It's the manifest destiny mentality that is racist against Hispanic, which is racist against blacks, which is racist against Indians. Our history is racist.
Yeah.
It really is.
Oh, yeah.
These aren't heroes necessarily. They're heroes if it's like a football game. It depends on which side you're on.
Yeah. Well,
and Gertie illustrates this by his complicated life. All these people were products of their environment, products of their time, products of their political elements. And Gertie, is he really a renegade, or is he just going with the flow to survive and do what he thinks is right?
Yeah.
Or is one side all right? Were the French right? Were the Indians right? Were the colonists right? Were the Americans right?
Well, and if you look at Gertie, at first he was a colonist, but then he becomes a Native American.
Absolutely.
Then he switches back to say, colonist, and he
then
goes
he switches
British
back again to the Indians. Then he helps the French.
He's all over the place.
Leads attacks into Kentucky with the Shawnee.
Yeah.
Fighting and killing.
That is
raiding.
That is the point to be is it's all about whose side you're on.
That's right. That's right. When we look at history, and historians call that the historical myth of America.
And too, the old saying is that history is written by the winners.
Absolutely, it really is.
And that's the way things go. Let's take a pause real quick.
All right.
Moving on a little farther into Simon Kenton and Simon Gertie's adventures, what we got?
Well, I want to, before we leave Simon Gertie completely, that was an interesting discussion on that. Simon Gertie takes part in Pontiac's rebellion, which was when the Shawnees, after the French and Indian War, began attacking settlements all across Kentucky and what we call the Northwest Territory. The Pontiac's war, they lost. Simon Gertie decides to move, like many British people, into Canada to escape retribution by the colonists. And he moves to Ontario in the 1800s, and about 1818, I believe it is, and he dies there. He starts having problems with his eyes, and he dies totally blind. That's how he winds up hiding out because he's paranoid that they're going to come look for him. The French, the English, other Indian tribes.
He's on a lot of people's names.
He's on the list. He really is, and he's also blamed for a lot of the violence, and he's well known, the most known renegade. Yeah, of his time. Now I want to return to Simon Kenton. And Simon Kenton moves and is married a couple of times, has 4 children. He marks a lot of land in Kentucky and what we now call West Virginia. And he becomes, by some accounts, the largest landowner in Kentucky.
Wow.
I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of acres of land that he's marked. He's illiterate. He can't read or write. And just like Boone, he loses most of his claims. Yeah. But at this time, he builds a big brick house in what's called Washington, Kentucky, near what is now Maysville. They called it Limestone back then, which was one of the entrance points to the Bluegrass. There were 2 ways to get into the Bluegrass. One was through Cumberland Gap, which came through Crab Orchard here. and on to Fort Logan and Fort Harrod and so forth, and into central Kentucky by foot. The other, and perhaps the most popular way, was to float down from Fort Pitt, Pennsylvania, which is Pittsburgh, come down to Limestone or to Louisville, where the falls were, if you wanted to go that far, and embark, and then come into central Kentucky, like into Lexington, Georgetown, Paris, Versailles, those places. So Limestone was a busy, busy center. And Simon Kenton, like Boone, it's close to Blue Licks, where this great hunting was, the cane brakes of Kentucky we talked about. They helped and issued people into areas, showed them where the land was to settle. And Simon Kenton was very, integral in doing that, just like Boone. Simon Kenton, some things about Simon Kenton is that he didn't believe in alcohol. I mean, there were taverns springing up everywhere, and that's how news got spread, but he wouldn't drink any alcohol. He thought alcohol was really bad for you, and he saw what it did to some of his friends and his men. But while they're coming down, the Shawnee see this huge flow of people, hundreds, perhaps even thousands, coming down the Ohio River, and they begin ambushing them, picking them off, men, women, children, killing them, all kinds of ploys and so forth. So Simon Kenton develops this group of frontiersmen that he handpicks into kind of like, you might compare them to today's Green Beret. They're the toughest, the slickest, the smartest fighters that he can find. And he organizes and becomes their leader. And they're called Minutemen, and on a moment's notice, whenever they hear that there have been some Indian attacks up the river, he immediately assembles them and goes after the Indians to see if there's any survivors, and also possibly to set ambushes. Now, from The Frontiersman, which is a book, that I highly recommend to anybody interested in Kentucky history, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best, by Alan W. Eckert. On April the 13th, 1781, there's an excerpt I'd like to read to you. Over and through March, in the first part of April, panic-stricken survivors of attacks reached the little port settlement called Limestone and told of the horrors they had undergone, of how the peaceful river had suddenly come alive, as a dozen or two canoes, each carrying 10 and 20 warriors, sped from hiding in little coves or creeks and converged on the boats of the immigrants. More often than not, no one escaped. It now became wise for river travelers to remain close as possible to the Kentucky shore. Boats coming down along the Ohio side, or even in the swift current of the middle, were apt to find themselves targets of snipers who rarely showed themselves and were content with picking off individual parties, one by one as they passed. In these rare cases, where survivors arrived to tell of their experiences, Simon Kenton somehow always seemed to be on hand to raise a party of men and travel upriver to the spot where the attack had taken place, hoping perhaps to find other survivors who were too weak or too frightened or too injured to travel and would die unless help came. So
I find it pretty interesting there where the Native Americans are really holding nothing back, trying to prevent more settlers into Kentucky and probably even Ohio and those areas. But that Kentucky at this point is considered kind of the safe side to be traveling. Would you say that's more just Kentucky's more settled at the moment?
Well, I think
more support?
I think most of the Shawnee, particularly that tribe of Indians, were coming down from Chillicothe and other places like that, Mad River country, and they were on the Ohio side of the river patrolling. The settlement at this time was all in Kentucky. It wasn't in Ohio. So,
thinking about this, Pennsylvania, I guess, would be where people are starting to migrate from as far as getting to Ohio.
A lot of Germans.
Yeah, because as we said before, Kentucky was just a hunting ground, so there wasn't really a strong Native American presence in the bluegrass region and that sort of area.
There were literally thousands of them coming down on boats. And in 1791, again from the frontiersmen, it was not often that Simon Kenton had an opportunity to set up an ambush for Indians. Normally, the reverse was true, and Kenton took the leadership of his men, the resultant chase of retaliation. But this time it had been different. From the moment Ben Whiteman and Neil Washburn had reported in from their rounds, he recognized it as a golden opportunity. For once it would be the Indians who walked into a trap set by one of the few white men who had ever been able to beat them at their own game. You're talking about Simon Kenton. So they see that they find some canoes that were sunk hidden by the Indians while they were raiding in Kentucky. And they assume that the Indians are going to be coming back with prisoners and loot that they've taken from cabins in northern or central Kentucky. And so it goes on, says, the big frontiersman considered the situation carefully. In his mind, he could picture so perfectly the area where the boats had been loaded that it was as if he were standing there, seeing not only the immediate area, but the adjacent North Shore. And he goes on, so they decide a 6-hour guard schedule was established because they found these Indian canoes, hidden, and they know the Indians are going to come back and cross the river again. So he established with his men a 6-hour guard established, and the first 2 men, Washburn and Whiteman, were left on shore to watch the Kentucky side for activity. It starts off, it was about 3 in the afternoon when the trio of Shawnees started to cross, laughing and talking as they paddled, wholly unaware of the trap. One was wearing a white shirt, and when the 8 guns fired, he was the only one not instantly killed. He fell along with the others, but then raised himself up and attempted to shove the boat back into the current, when another volley caught him, and he crumpled. The tired horses that they had were easy to catch. Kenton sent Fowler and McIntyre back to the camp with them. Kenton ordered it stripped and to be taken back to Maysville with them for possible identification. That's the white shirt that he's talking about on the dead man. Then, and he goes on. So Kenton laid a successful trap, and they waited there a bit longer, and another group came through, and he caught them and killed all them. Then another group, and he caught them and killed all them. And so this was just an example of one successful raid. And as the book points out, Kenton knew how to set an ambush that only Indians knew how to do. He could beat them at their own game.
Yeah.
So, he was really something. I want to just say one other thing that I've read, and there's so many things I think of and that I can add about Simon Kenton, but he moved into Ohio later on and took a settlement up there near Urbana and also around Springfield. And when he was getting older, he attended a revival.
Yeah.
And in this revival, Kenton listened real carefully. And after the revival was over, he asked the minister. He said, if you'd take a walk with him, a private walk in the woods, which Simon Kenton did. And of course, Simon Kenton was illiterate, and he wanted to know what the Bible said.
Yeah.
And Kenton told the man, he said, you said that if we repent, we can have eternal life. He said, I'll tell you something. He said, I've killed a lot of people. He told the minister, he said, I've killed white men, lots of them. He said, I've killed lots of Indians. And he said, I've really been a sinner my whole life. He said, I've killed all kinds of people.
Yeah.
And the minister told him, said, if you repent, you can be saved by the grace of God.
Wow.
And it really affected him. But he was an old man then. He was probably through killing. But, nevertheless.
My back's going out. I ain't killing no more
that's
men.
right. That's right. That's kind of what he did. And he lived there the rest of his life. He lost most of his land in Kentucky from being the largest landowner. He lost nearly all of it.
Yeah.
He was just like Boone. He lived on a pension of $20 a month or a year or something that they gave him. It was because he was illiterate. He didn't record things in courthouses just like Boone.
Yeah.
And
like we said earlier, him and Boone were a lot alike, and wanted to be out in the woods away from other people. So why would you want to go to a courthouse and settle this stuff and be around?
That's right. Well, if you couldn't read or write either. So it shows you the importance of education.
Oh, yeah.
Another thing, comparing Boone and Kenton, Boone, actually, I think he liked the Indians. He respected them, and he liked them a lot. I don't think Kenton did.
Yeah.
I don't think Kenton liked the Indians. I think he hated the Indians. I think he saw a lot of the brutality that they had and what they did to him and so forth. So he wasn't a big fan. He wasn't real good. Boone was adopted
Boone was
by
ready
the chief.
to stay.
And he was ready to stay, man. I mean, he was having a high time of his life. He had a squaw and everything else. He had everything set out. He was a big, the son of the chief, Simon Kenton, if it hadn't been for Simon Girty, he'd been in trouble.
Yeah,
he'd been dead.
Well, and too, when Boone, he was captured, adopted, kind of got this free reign of things.
Right.
Simon Kenton was running through the gauntlet time and time again.
And Simon Girty got him out, and he was adopted, but he didn't really want to be adopted. It was just a political ploy to save his bacon.
Yeah.
Simon Kenton, he was an Indian fighter. He didn't much like him. Another important note I wanted to make about Simon Kenton was that he was involved in the Battle of the Thames or Fallen Timbers, and that was the battle in which Tecumseh was killed. And because Simon Kenton knew Tecumseh, this great Shawnee warrior, they asked him to identify him out on the battlefield, his body. And Simon Kenton knew that they were going to mutilate his body with knives, butcher belts to sharpen knives with and everything out of his skin.
Yeah.
And so he knew there was another chief there, and he purposely saw Tecumseh, but told him, pointed to the other chief and said that was Tecumseh, and they mutilated his body, but he had respect for Tecumseh and didn't want to have his body disgraced, and the Indians were able to take his body back and bury it properly.
Well, that shows a lot of
respect.
A lot of respect for because we just been mentioned how we kind of feel like Simon Kenton didn't really like the Native Americans as much,
but he did respect. He had mutual respect for some people. Yeah.
And that will lead us to, again, we talked about how history has different points of view. So when we talk about Tecumseh, we'll be able to address a little bit more of that on the Native American side of things. As we go through this, it's interesting how we're setting up all these different characters, and yet how much they intertwined and had issues, conflicts with each other, and yet they all kind of were in forming Kentucky in a way, really getting land, making way for settlers, and it all just kind of
the Ohio River Valley.
Yeah,
that's right,
coming together here.
That's right, and so that ends it.
Yeah. Well, thinking about Simon Kenton, Daniel Boone, and we'll mention Simon Girty, even though he probably wasn't as influential on Kentucky as far as frontiering. I guess, is that accurate? Yeah. Is that an accurate statement?
I don't know. It depends on whose side you're on. I think we made that point. I think, for the Indians, he may have been a hero, or something. But he was also a product of his times. And, it's this idea of manifest destiny, of going west and everything belongs to the colonial whites, and don't let anything stand in your way. Yeah. You can't stop us, whether you're Hispanic or
English,
or you're a black slave or anything else. Even if you're helping to build an empire, it doesn't matter. So it's a little different. And
how you look at it.
It's right. We look at our ancestors. If you're white, and you say, well, I lived over in Rockcastle County, and my family settled there early on in the mountains of Appalachia and came over the mountains from North Carolina or Virginia or wherever, And,
no, you're hitting it. Appalachian Mountains. I think maybe Pikeville, then North Carolina, and then Germany was before that.
Yes.
Though. So
very typical. You probably floated down on a boat if you were in Germany and came into the area that way. Yeah. Got off in West Virginia, which was another remarkable place to get off. Timber and coal and lots of game.
Which brings things back to Kentucky history. There's a lot of influence in every little corner, and honestly, from the world comes into Kentucky.
And I can't help but mention how much geography plays a part in history. When I was young, I didn't realize that, but gosh, the bluegrass and the fight over fertile land, spring water. This was something that was really important. I mean, it's survival.
Yeah.
And the resources, and we're still fighting them over it today, whether it's oil in the Mideast or whatever.
Let's talk about this frontiersman real quick, because we've read excerpts from it, just about 2 or 3 episodes at least. Where does Alan W. Eckert get
He's written
his resources?
a series of books, and he's resourced things very well.
Is it from journals and that kind of stuff?
Yes, everything, and museums and original copies of things. And he has the date and references. The back of the book's just full of, everything he says is kind of, and he really brings it to life by telling a story. He's a storyteller of sorts, but it's really factual, and it's narratives of America. It's a powerful epic of violence and vengeance in the conquest of America's what we call the Northwest Territory, which is Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and so forth. But it's really good. And it's a story of Tecumseh, who we may want to do a podcast on,
all right,
and Simon Kenton, all right, and a little bit with Boone. But it's mainly the story of Simon Kenton and Tecumseh, who was this extravagant, interesting human being, a Shawnee who grew up in this troubled time. It's a fantastic book, and it talks about Fort Logan, Fort Harrod, Boonesboro. It talks about all these events, Blue Licks, and so forth. It's everything that, if you love Kentucky history, it's laid out there.
So a suggestion here: if you want to get the Frontiersman, go check it out. If not, you can just keep listening to us, and
That's right.
We're about to cover it all.
We'll give you the excerpts. That's right. Yeah.
So coming up next will be we'll talk about Tecumseh.
That'll be fine.
And maybe some of the other forts.
Yes.
Fort Logan, Fort Herod. We can get some of that stuff in. We're going to stay around a few more episodes in this sort of time period. I guess if we could label this time periods as far as Kentucky goes, what would we call it?
Well, we'd probably call it frontier settlement.
Frontier settlement. So well, and we're just making that up
Exploration
right now.
and settlement.
Okay,
We're making everything up.
yeah, and then eventually we will get into Kentucky will become a state, and then we will work our way into the Civil War, which will have a lot, I assume,
and
to
maybe
discuss.
Before the Civil War, the golden agriculture area of Kentucky. You know, the area which is, you know, it's kind of sad that used slaves and so forth, but, you know, when you drive through Kentucky and you see these beautiful brick mansions, you know, that go back the 1830s, 1820s, 1840s, you know, that was this area where agriculture was king.
Yeah, and
people made great fortunes.
Yes, and we'll have to get into
and set up for the Civil War.
Yeah, and we'll definitely have to get into William Whitley as well.
Yeah,
local here in around Crab Orchard because well, we can get into horse racing and all that stuff with William Whitley. All right, with that being said, we're going to wrap this one up. We are once again sorry it took so long to get this one out, but had to get Mr. Hope had to ride a few horses out there at Keeneland.
That's right. And
if you have any suggestions, any comments on any sort of things we're discussing,
send us money.
Yeah, send us some money. You can connect to us on Facebook, on our Cable Podcast Network Facebook page, and you can send us
advertisement. Kentucky Long Rifle.
Yeah.
Artifact.
Yeah. Which you want to bring that up, Mr. Pope? We might want to at some point talk about some artifacts. I know you have a lot of historical things we could talk about, and I can post pictures and stuff on the Facebook so people could see what we're talking about. So we got plenty to do. So stick around, and we'll see you next time, I guess.
All right. Thank you.
We would like to thank all of our listeners out there who support the show by listening to each and every episode. We couldn't do it without you. From all across the U.S., we thank you for the support. If you would like to join the conversation and give your thoughts on this podcast and other episodes, join the Cable Podcast Network group on Facebook. If you are enjoying the content of this podcast, consider visiting anchor.fm/themeadows KYhistory/support. You can also find this link in the show's description, or check out the Cable Podcast Network Patreon page. If you want to help this podcast grow in other ways, like the Cable Podcast Network page on Facebook and share our links on all social media outlets. You can find the Cable Podcast Network on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, give us a positive review and leave a comment. Thanks again for all your support.